Hey, Mark, welcome to Shared Narratives.
Hey, Lily, thank you for having me.
So excited to chat with you. I have been following you on Twitter for a long time. So excited to get to know the person behind the Twitter. We may have some new listeners here. So I should say up front, like one of the driving forces for creating this podcast is that I believe we all have a lot more in common than we think. We just don't really know it and we don't hear other people's stories. And one of my goals is to like amplify voices of the next generation who may not be invited on Joe Rogan, but have a lot to say and should be heard. So to kick it off, the question I ask everyone, because I'm really interested, is where did you grow up and what were you like as a kid?
So, I was born at the Naval Academy, but I grew up in McLean, Virginia, for most of my life after about two or three. And so, what was I like as a kid is a very good question. I would say it probably can be summed up as a typical boy, hyperactive, pretty mischievous. I think it was sixth grade that one of my teachers said in a parent teacher conference, Mark is a bully, but he's only a bully to other bullies. So I like to use that to describe how I was as a kid.
It's so funny. Did you have one of those like senior year superlatives when you were in high school? Like you were voted most likely to.
I did not. No, we didn't do that at my high school. I was just trying not to get suspended by the end of my senior year in high school. So I wasn't too worried about the superlative, just trying to graduate.
Yeah, for sure. So funny. I don't know why I thought of that recently. I feel like it was such a 90s, 2000s thing of goofy
Hmm.
yearbook superlatives. Anyway, so, you worked in finance, you had
Yep.
some pretty awesome roles in finance, but then you went on this dating reality TV show, F Boy Island. And I know it's a really fun story of both how they found you and like what you wanted to get out of it, but tell us that story.
Sure. So I was working as an investment banker in New York, and COVID had hit. And so in September of 2020, my college track team and six other teams at William and Mary, where I went for undergrad, were cut. And so it was a very formative experience for me running track, and one that I always thought that everyone should have the opportunity to do. I think it turned me into who I am. So I dug my heels in with a few other individuals, and we were able to save these teams, and it led to 11 teams at Stanford being saved as well. But I started to see the power of narrative, and specifically some of the articles on this wall behind me actually were kind of the first narrative placements that I did. And I was working as a banker. I wasn't passionate about it. I went to law school, did a joint law degree MBA, and took out a ton of loans. And so I was at the point where I knew I was about to pay off my student loans. And then I started to kind of see the golden handcuffs slowly encircling my wrists. And so I knew that I had to do something, but I didn't know what. So I really liked this experience. I think it was 67 days or so that we fought to save the track team. We were able to successfully do that, but you kind of start off placing a narrative in the local Williamsburg Gazette, and that goes to the Richmond Times Dispatch, and then the Washington Post, and then USA Today. And I thought, okay, I really like PR, narrative, storytelling. He or she who controls the narrative controls everything in life. So I was very spellbound by that. And right prior to that, my ex girlfriend was working at Fox and COVID starts. So she says to me one night, well, it's a big opportunity for me at work. She was a production assistant, which is kind of like the lowest level. And so she goes, we're switching to a 24-hour news cycle. COVID had just begun, but I have to stay up all night. And I said, okay, I have enough work. So it's like 4 in the morning. And she asked me how to phrase something. And we're working in my one bedroom apartment in New York. And it's cramped, and I say XYZ. But then 5 minutes later, I hear that same phrase come out of the TV. And I turn around and I see that it's just this black screen with white fonts. And it kind of hit me that all of these things that we take for granted that come from a TV, and this was before I think the main fracturing of media that's happened since. But it shocked me that it's like someone is just typing something and people are reading it off, and then people take it as gospel. So I was fascinated with those two experiences. But it's December of 2020, and I go in and I get my bonus. And so I go up to my cubicle and I pay off my student loans. And immediately I go on the dating app Hinge. And I match with this woman who's like, "Hey, I don't live in New York and I have a boyfriend, but have you ever thought about doing reality TV?" And I'm like, "Absolutely not. I am not going to go ruin my life and do something that insane." And so she kept pressuring me to do this. And I never really utilized my law degree, but I was like, okay, why don't I just kind of negotiate my contract here, see what I can get from it? And so I didn't know the name of this show. I knew it was a scripted, or excuse me, unscripted, but these things, and we can get into it, are kind of scripted, reality TV dating show. And there was a group of good guys and there was a group of bad guys. And I was a good guy on it, and it was going to take place in the Caymans, but I knew that it was going to happen in a few weeks. So I thought, okay, well, I have the negotiating power. Maybe I'll go write a book going from Wall Street to reality TV. Who knows? But I was able to negotiate everything I wanted in the contract. And so I was kind of surprised. And at that point, it's one of those things, you go down a route not knowing what the ultimate outcome will be. And, in hindsight, everything leads you to where you are now. But I didn't really think much of it. And so then it was probably late January of 2020. And I finally told my parents. They're some of the last people I told. And my dad says to me, so he's 76, he's a military psychologist, still works for the VA, but is the last person that I thought would be encouraging of this. He goes, why not do it? You might learn something about yourself. And so when he said that, then it all kind of became real. And I was like, I guess I'm going to do this. So I went to the Caymans for 3 months during COVID. We had 2 weeks of quarantine, because it was a maskless country. And it's fascinating. The funny story of, so The Firm by John Grisham, great book, great movie. It was filmed in the early 90s in the Caymans. And that is what led to the reputation of money laundering for the Caymans overall, for the rest of the world, right? And so they closed off the entire film industry after that. They hadn't had a single large scale production set in the Caymans until this untitled reality TV show, which ended up being called F Boy Island. And so I had to call my mom when I found out the name of the show. I was like, "So the name of the show is F Boy Island." She's like, "Don't worry, your brother already told me." I had to go on Urban Dictionary for what that was, but it was a phenomenal experience. And one of the things I think that is the biggest takeaway is the friendships that I was able to make on it. Because as a white male being on Wall Street, the diversity there would be, well, did someone go to Yale or did they go to Harvard undergrad, right? Like there's nothing. And so I was someone who growing up, I went to a very diverse high school, but I always had a very diverse group of friends through sports. And it kind of hit me that, through athletics, that's one of your main exposures to people from different socioeconomic classes, right? Growing up. But then when you kind of fall into a professional setting, like going to law school, going to business school, you lose all that, right? And you kind of lose your connection with the rest of society almost. And you're in these kind of hyper niche, almost echo chambers. And so going on the show, I was, in a room with one guy who he's from the hood in Charlotte, another guy who he just had a kid, but we'd stay up all night and we're talking about these life experiences. And one of them says to me, he goes, when his dad was serving a life sentence in prison, he says, "What was it like playing catch with your dad growing up?" And it made me cry when I heard it, because you're kind of struck of, I know the world how I know it, right? And you can assume, hey, this is how it is for most people, but you just get hit with, these kind of, to your point in the beginning of this, the shared narratives or experiences we have. Some people aren't fortunate to have the experiences that we take for granted. And so I left that show. I lost the show. I was eliminated in like the third or fourth episode, but it was really the friendships and the experience of it that stayed with me, and I'm lifelong friends with these guys. So it was a very circuitous route that led me there, and I'm the last person that I would have ever thought would go on reality TV, but one of, if not the best experiences of my life, because I think I was 29 at the time. And I was getting to the point where, I was just going to continue down this path in life. And I would have looked back and really kind of wondered, maybe I should have taken more risk. Maybe I should have done something different. But that experience then kind of catapulted me to where I am now.
So cool. One of the things that stood out in you telling that story is you didn't even mention the dating aspect of it, like the women. You talked about the friendships and what
Mhm.
you gained from it. And that's so interesting. If you had met someone, would you have been open to kind of like pursuing a relationship that way? Or did it feel too manufactured? Like you can't find love on, a reality show?
Great question. It's hyper manufactured,
Yeah.
and I'll give two examples. But so the first was when we were going through customs in the airport. We flew out from Miami to Grand Cayman, and when we were going through, we didn't really know the format of the show. But I knew that there were more men than women. And so then judging who's on the flight, you kind of pick out, okay, these three. But I kept seeing this group of three women kind of ushered away, from the men. They're sitting in the front of the plane. And, this is a extremely nerve-wracking situation. Like, I'm going from Wall Street to guys who and like I'm in shape, I work out, but it's like these guys, it's like they're fitness instructors and everything, and it's this competition with this
Hmm.
stress unlike anything else because you're all trying to out ego everyone else there. And so but I'm watching this group of women, and so I go through customs after them, and I noticed that the customs people, they were writing the phone numbers down for people. You had to give them your details. So I memorized the three phone numbers, and then I had 2 weeks in quarantine with my laptop and nothing else. So I was able to find like all the information on these women. I don't think I said that before, but I could kind of guess. I knew the backstories of a lot of them. One of the girls, Sarah, even her father had actually worked in the same military hospital that my father had at one point in time. So I had all these things like prepared to say. But then you go on the show, and I went on a date with CJ. I think it's in the second episode. And on TV, it's maybe 30 seconds to a minute that you're shown various clips of in culmination, but that was 8 hours. And so you're constantly like you're going, and then there'll be these breaks and these pauses. And at one point, we're sitting on top of a Jeep. And I kept making a joke, is this a Jeep commercial? And they're like, Mark, shut up, stop talking. And then she said something to me that I knew I had only said in, they're called on the fly interviews, like the one-on-one kind of confessional type things. And I only said it to one of the producers there. And I knew that for a fact. And I stopped and I looked at her, and then I could see this little earbud peeking out of the corner of her ear. It's like, oh, got it. Okay, so they're telling you, and then it was over after that. No one really liked me, but it became a fascinating game with the production team because I think reality TV in Hollywood, it's pretty similar to New York, but or DC for that matter. But at least in New York, people, they'll fuck you over to your face. Versus in Hollywood is much more of this elaborate cat and mouse game. And I started to see that. So once I treated it almost like investment banking and like this cutthroat world, it was a great load of fun. And I went from just staring at screens all day, right, at work, working on Microsoft Office and Excel for 18 hours a day, to when I got eliminated, I lived in a castle in the Caymans on the East End. And I was just able to read and just hang out all day. And it was awesome. So I had a phenomenal experience.
That's such a good story. I will tell you a little anecdote is I love a couple reality shows and my mom always
Okay.
makes fun of she always makes fun of me for it. She's like, "Lily, you have an MBA. You don't need to watch reality TV."
Hmm.
And what she doesn't realize is that there's actually a lot to learn from it. Like, A, how
Hmm.
these people go about the business of it, how they parlay the reality TV into successful
Hmm.
business careers after. So I could spend a whole hour on this, but we're not going to. So
Well,
fascinating.
well, to
And
that point, though, reality TV is fascinating because, especially after the fracturing of mainstream media, it is really the only medium that can get over 50% of people's attention, right? And when you think about it in that context, it's absolutely fascinating.
imagine a world, this would absolutely never happen, but just imagine how funny it would be if you like found the next politician via a reality show where people could actually like have a say in who they like, who
Hmm.
stands out, who resonates. God, that would be so funny.
Well, it's funny you say that because I have always toyed with the idea of that. And so I have a few drafts of reality TV show focused on potential campaign, but I look at it as the problem with politics is dishonesty. It's an inherent disconnect between people and then who's supposed to be the voice of the people, right? And when you think of it that way, it's like, well, now with Twitter, it's a little bit easier for people to get their ideas to their elected official. But if you were able to really see a campaign from the beginning to the end, follow it along, I think it's a fascinating opportunity for people to learn. Democracy is it's not democracy for everyone. It's only for those who participate. And when you look at in most congressional races, it's only 10 to 12% of the electorate that actually participates in a primary who's determining the main candidate because the district will be so overwhelmingly one way or another. But I look at it as Washington, D.C., it's the best reality TV show that isn't a reality TV show. And in an ironic way, I do view the way to get more transparency in DC is getting people on camera more because when you can't hide and you have to be out there and flawed and vulnerable, which I think politics is moving in that direction. And that was something that I saw even going back to 2018 because I've always thought about running for office, but I saw that Gen Z, like I'm 33, I'm a millennial, but Gen Z, what they value, and especially why people value TikTok, is the authenticity and the vulnerability that one shows. And I saw that. And as I grew a social media following, I was able to really like, tap into that. It's like the more you give, the more it's received, right? And I think it's a fascinating thing that politicians should be aware of. But also, I think it's the more of the imperfect flaws that you see of people, the more you like them, the more connection there is. But a line that stuck with me for my first day of filming on F Boy Island was it's right before we're supposed to start. And this jacked guy, his name is Jared from Miami, he's a fitness trainer. And he's next to me, and I'm in a linen suit, being like, "Hey, I'm Mark," and we start talking, we hit it off. But he says this expression to me that sticks with me, and I think about it a lot. But he goes, "I'm perfectly imperfect," and I just love that expression because I think it's so true. But anyways, I'm rambling now.
No, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think one of the obviously I'm not a politician, but I know a couple of politicians, is I think one of the challenges is that there is a pressure to be perfect online, either because people will judge you, they'll cancel you, they'll take something out of context, the list goes on. And when you actually put out a lot of content, almost like the Trump MAGA approach, it's like nothing really matters because there's so much of it and not each individual piece is so heavy and weighted. I'd be curious because you're so good at social media and you understand new media, if you were going to be, this is a made up role, like head of social media for, the Democratic Party right now, what would you do? Like, what tactics would you try to experiment with? And what do you think they're doing today that they should stop doing?
Well, that's a great question because the Democratic Party the other day, they announced they're going to put $20 million in to figure out how to talk to young men. And it is the
Yeah.
most insane thing I've ever heard. It's like you talk to young men by being authentic and transparent. And for me, my thesis was okay, I'm going to go on reality TV. And then there's really no one who within the niche finance community has a face out there. Like there's a lot of these accounts without faces. And so my goal was to be kind of a micro niche influencer in the finance space and was able to attain that pretty quickly. So that thesis was validated. But I found really that it was when I would talk about mental health. Of seeing a therapist or having to push back at work to some toxic boss to be able every Tuesday go talk to someone. And small things like that, that then the feedback though was overwhelming. And then I started to get a lot of questions in my DMs from kids being like, hey, I'm really going through it right now. Or my girl, like a lot of it is, long-term girlfriend and I just broke up, all of that. And, I think for what I saw, like having gone to great schools and really kind of like following the exact playbook of like what one should do in life. And then I don't know if I did it on purpose, but it was definitely like in my subconscious of once you go on a show called F Boy Island, you go from like UVA Law and Centerview to F Boy Island. Like there's really nothing that holds you back anymore. Like you don't have that kind of social constriction that I think most people live with. And it's a very liberating thing. But on social media, what I found is I started answering questions that I get from these young men. So my following is 93% male, which I don't know anyone else aside from maybe Andrew Tate, right? But the problem is that there are no male role models. And I don't look at myself as a role model, but I think I look at myself as someone with a lot of different life experiences. And that's why people like to reach out and ask questions. But what has stood out to me, like I have a very strong belief in myself and a confidence that I've gotten because I've had to put the work in of education, constantly learning all of that stuff, right? But it's something that we have a crisis of confidence in young men. We have this lost generation of young men, and they are looking for role models and people who aspire to be, rather than kind of these fake personalities that I think we've been fed. And so a lot of it, in terms of I think what the Democrats are doing, well, like Harry Sisson, for example, right? I saw him posting on Twitter, and it was clear he was being paid by the DNC, right? And he's not disclosing it, and it's in the summer. And so I say to one of my friends who was a position with JD Vance at the time, and I say, hey, my other buddy Bryce Hall, who's got millions of followers on social media, why don't you get him on the campaign? Because if they're going to do that, then you guys should have the opportunity to do it as well. And so then next thing, a week later, Bryce Hall's on stage with Trump in Vegas, and which isn't an explicit endorsement of Trump or anything, but I looked at it as it's like in this area where I know for a fact that young men are getting their views on social media. Well, it should be a fair battle. And then I think you really saw the Republican Party win on social media, but part of it was because they offered more of themselves. And so when I look at what the Democratic Party is doing, it's these people who have these preconceived notions of how politicians should be or how they should act, or you're two-faced about things, right? Like if you are Cuomo and you're running for mayor, and it's like you have all these allegations of harassment and everything, it's like, are there not more people, right? Are there not more people out there? And I think a big thing that I've started to think about the idea of running for Congress. And one of the things that I realize is it's like there are so many people who have encouraged me to do it, who say, oh, we want to help out on your campaign. We want to do this, do that. And it's really because I put myself out there. And people aren't necessarily looking for a perfect role model, right? But they're looking for someone that has done something that maybe they aspire to put themselves out there more, or they aspire to be more confident. And so the more you do something, the more it gives them confidence. And I think that just being a person who is not afraid to deviate from the traditional path and say things that I think most people would assume wouldn't come out of my mouth. It's really been something that I think has resonated with young men specifically, but it's the overwhelming breakdown of my social media that it's young men, and my girlfriend finds it fascinating because we'll be walking around and like someone will come up to me and say X Y Z, and I met her last year, but I was trying to explain to her kind of like how this all happened. It's like, I mean, everyone who was in on Wall Street, they knew it's a huge risk to go from a center view, which some would consider the best investment bank, to a reality TV show. But people love that. And they knew that it took balls to do. And it's something I've never been afraid to do. And it's almost like, well, if not me, then who, right? And I think you have to live life in that manner. But oftentimes, like I'll see something and really comment on it. So like with investment banking, I've probably been the main person who's been advocating for better treatment for junior bankers because I was one of these guys at one point in time, and I know what it's like. And you see all these suicides. And I can tell you exactly. It's someone who has grown up. They've achieved every single thing that they've been told they should do. They go to Wharton wherever they go, right? And then they get to Wall Street, and it's this part of you gets broken inside when you realize, like, I'm not going to go be a master of the universe. I'm on Microsoft Excel all day. No one actually cares about my analysis or strategic advisory, right? And you start to see how your life is going to be very different than you thought it would be. And I think that's what a lot of young men struggle with. That men specifically, which I can speak to, they strive for a higher purpose, a higher meaning, right? We all want to do great things or to do things that people will remember us for, or to be just a strong male. And I think that we've grown up in this generation where there haven't been male role models, but there have been a lot of weak men. And also, masculinity as a whole it, it has not really been allowed to succeed, and boys haven't been allowed to be boys. I think the average recess time has dropped 60 minutes since 2001. And if you look at the percentage of young men, young boys who are on ADHD stimulants, it's double. It's 50% more than young girls. And it's like, well, society has a masculinity problem, and they've treated, instead of treating masculinity and boys and girls as separate, they've just medicated boys. And so I look at it as, how many young boys who, to go back to the question in the beginning of what was I like, who were rambunctious, who were behavior problems, had a lot of their potential cut because they were just told, okay, you don't behave, you're a problem. And you hear that over and over. It creates a concept in your head that I think a lot of young men are struggling with. And you see it on the internet, right? You start to see this kind of pushback against mainstream, if you will, or what's we've assumed mainstream to be. And for a lot of these guys who follow me on Twitter, they have burner accounts. So an account that is some like dipshit capital or whatever, and they're always hilarious. But most of them they're corporate lawyers or they're investment bankers, and so because of their compliance, they have to have a burner account. But they're unhinged and they're saying their true opinions. And I think a lot of it is people just want to say what's on their mind rather than have to feel that it's been this kind of, pre 2024 politically correct era, and you'd get crucified for having an ounce of testosterone. And I think when you look at the Democratic Party, they're getting mad at David Hogg for being like, okay, we need people who appeal to young guys, because all they've tried to do is almost like this performative kind of diversity type thing, right? Where like if you don't have blue hair, that God forbid a straight white male, be allowed to speak. And it's like, but it's the reverse when you do that. It's just as bad, right, as it is to exclude people because of who they are. And so I think what they have to do is realize that what young men see is this performed sense of hyper masculinity. Like Tim Walz was not a man anyone aspires to be, right? Like he's a very weak man who I think is the antithesis of what someone wants to be. But people look at Trump and they see, okay, he's making decisions, he's having opinions, he is being a strong individual leader, regardless of his policies or anything. But I think it's this idea that we have to allow young men to be young men. We have to allow them to be a little bit loud, a little bit aggressive. It's kind of like the American ethos, right? But it's been shut off for so long. And so the big thing though is just authenticity and being able, like these kids with the burner accounts, they're saying what they want to say. That is exactly what they want to do, but they can't say that normally, or they'll only say it in their small groups. At work or with their friends where they know they're safe. And I think the big thing is people need to live in a world where they're not going to get canceled for their ideas. That if we live in a world where we're afraid to debate and to disagree civilly with each other, then we don't have freedom. We don't have democracy. We have this censored state like in North Korea. And it's like, hey, what we should aspire to have is where, I can have an opinion, you can have an opinion, and we can disagree, but we can debate it. And I think with AI, there are these things like Claude Kids where they apparently, like, my girlfriend's mother is a teacher, and they just like ask the chat GPT, or chat as they call it, like this so that there's no critical thinking. And it's like, oh god, that is so scary, because if you can't debate ideas and you're just taking it verbatim from AI, which is, a compilation of polling from various sources without vetting sources, well, that's the problem. And it's almost like the reverse of, like boomers can't tell something's AI, but then, can Gen Z, are they going to be able to differentiate between what's fake news, what's real news? But it all goes back to, I think, that we have to create a society where people can civilly disagree, but be able to debate. That's where the best ideas come from. The best, I think, friendships often, like one of my best friends, we almost fought each other the first time we met, and I look at that as like a traditional male friendship. Like, you hate each other first, and then you get to know each other, figure out how much we all do have in common. Because I think, to your point, 60 to 70% of us believe in the same core things, and it's really just these things on the edges that polarize us. But specifically, I think what's missed with young men is that they're not as extreme as, I think, a lot of, academic women would want to think. They're not all incels, but oftentimes they are online much more than women, and their viewpoints or their perceptions of the world get reinforced. And there's this thing with Andrew Tate, like the 80-20 rule. Because I subscribed to Andrew Tate's thing, whatever it's called, for like a month last summer, because I was so curious of, like, he is the main male role model, right? And there's really no one else. What is it? And it's like, well, he emphasizes for these kids, like, go train, like work out, and then they do their scams. But it's the concept of, like, my mom always says, raising boys is just like a dog. Make sure they're fed and tired out from exercise. And that's really, I think a good way of looking at it. But there's so many of these lost young men who have grown up and they haven't been listened to, and now they're working a corporate job and they're just disaffected and they have no passion. They have a smaller friend group because of COVID has shaped their undergrad or high school experience. And also, just growing up online, it totally, warps your perception. And so I think just what's needed is more men, and it's going to be led by millennials, just to be out there being like, it's okay to be a male, but everyone should aspire to be a strong male, because if we don't have strong men, well, women are hurt in the process too. When there are weak men or men who don't want to play their role in the family unit, I think, like, the family unit's been entirely destroyed, right? And it's like we haven't even been able to ask questions about that. You look what that does to communities. It perpetuates so many horrible things. But it's like we need better role models, and it's one of those things. It's like, well, who am I to say we need that and not do something about
There's so much that you said that I want to react to.
it? I rambled for a little bit.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, so much I want to say. On the topic of getting out of the crisis with young men, obviously there's a lot of discourse and I think good conversations that are happening that are backwards looking, but it's the forward looking solutions that I haven't really seen or heard that are like more tangible and tactical. You're sort of alluding to some of them, but who's responsible? Like, what institutions are going to bring us out of that crisis? Who's going to set the example? And, like, what are the programs or initiatives, which sounds so lame to say, but like, what's actually going to move the needle beyond just like you, who's awesome, being like one person online, which doesn't scale?
That's a great question, and it's something I think about a lot. I do a variety of things these days, but actually, I guess two of them relate to this question. One of which is working on narrative seeding for Air Force recruitment and retention, and it's something I got involved with recently. Long story, but kind of an older individual seeing I can see narratives online, being like, how do we drum up enlistment? And I thought a few things that okay, the military is great. Like if you read Hillbilly Elegy and JD Vance, he was a lost young man until he joined the Marine Corps and they gave him discipline. And so having grown up in a military family, I saw that firsthand. And it was something that I think was formative for me, but a lot of young men should have an experience like that because if you don't get something through sport, which I think sports play a huge role, having good coaches, having good mentors, which I think those are two things any male can do, right? You know, if you see someone promising or someone similar, then you look out for them, you help guide them in their career. I've been blessed with a lot of great mentors and people have taken, a liking to me and helped guide me both in sport and professionally. But I think too, the military is a great opportunity for a lot of people. One of the ideas that I've been thinking through recently is I think about this lost generation of young men who've grown up on the internet. And when you think about our kind of cyber and intel operations, it's spread across basically seven different agencies. And I thought the other day, well, if we were to have a cyber force that would be, similar to an air force, in terms of there's structure, but you're not going in war, right? Not, I mean, the fighter pilots do, but a lot of these jobs are on the computer. Well, you can capture this generation of lost young men who have the skill set and the ability that's not being used, right? And so this idea of a cyber force is one that I've been toying with and I talk with a lot of people about because it excites me because I think what we need to do when you look at the future of the world in war, it's going to be fought with biomedical weapons and it's going to be fought on the internet, specifically with misinformation, disinformation. And you can see how that is already occurring. But there are so many kids who they're in their mom's basement and they're on Reddit, they're on Twitter, they're playing Call of Duty. Well, those are the minds that we need to give meaning to, right? Because I think it's a formative life experience, whether it's through sport or the military, that shapes a young man's trajectory in life. And so I look at it as we have to really provide these paths, right? Whether it's this new division of the armed forces with a cyber force, or whether it's just overall a greater sentiment of patriotism. That it's fascinating to me because my girlfriend is from this small town called Porterville, California, and they have one of, if not the highest percentage of veterans per capita. And when I was there, I was struck. It's a town predominantly of Mexican Americans, probably 60%. There are two Marine Corps recruiting stations. And so I said to my dad, I was like, what is it with Mexican Americans and the Marines? It's like, well, there's so much honor and prestige with being in the Marine Corps, right? But that is culturally what a lot of Latinos strive to have. And so, that leads them to join the Marine Corps over the Army. It's just this fascinating thing. But, I think what we have to do is these institutions that are formative, that they have to be advocated for and that it should be a path of hey, if you don't necessarily know what you want to do, well, let's not force college and student debt on someone. Go figure it out, join the military, and then you'll have 4 years to fall down a service route, see if you like it. There's so many jobs now. I mean, especially when you think about where drone warfare is going, that you could be flying a drone out of Nellis Air Force Base and never have to be physically on the ground in combat. That the world is going to be a much more dangerous place in the future. That if you think about it, and I think any American should feel this way, that the architecture of America is perfect. The implementation has not been perfect. But without America, the world will fail. That we are the most important country and we are the gatekeeper for the rest of the world. And that can mean many different things to many people. But without a strong America and showing that we have the potential for force, then other bad actors will surface and they will act, and people will die and people will get hurt. So I look at it as there has to be, and I think things are trending. There's been a big shift, I would say, in the past few months of you're allowed to be proud of America now. And I don't think we've been able to feel like that for a long time. And it's a dangerous thing. And I meet so many people who are my age who are disaffected by America, or it's that the founding fathers were slave owners. It's like first off, like I think that it's like everyone wants to call Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is like my inspiration in life, and I read so much about him that I feel like I can tap into the guy's energy. But he is actually my aunt's husband, so my uncle, but not by blood. So my uncle's mother, Fawn Brody, she was the first historian to come out and say that Jefferson had kids with Sally Hemings, even though that was in newspaper reports going back to his time as president. But he, so when he was ambassador to France, that I didn't know if you'd expect a Jefferson history lesson, but here we are. Um, so James Heming, Sally's brother, he was Jefferson's chef in France, and so slavery was illegal in France. And he stayed in France as a free man after that. But Sally, who in all of his daily notes, he spent more money on her clothing than he did for any of his dogs, a disproportionate amount, including this silver locket that has never been found. And that is like this one piece of history that I want someone to find one day. But she decided to go back to Virginia with him, knowing what her life would be. And it's my belief that they were in love. And he was a man who was ahead of his time. And this sounds like an insane thing to think about or to say if you just want to look at someone in this simplistic perspective. But few people know that he was one of the people in Virginia who advocated for slave owners to be able to release their slaves. That got shot down in the Virginia House of Delegates immediately because none of the slave owners wanted that. And yes, he did have slaves, but he was someone who, understood the ills of it. And and I think that's a story that's much it's the apotheosis of America, that it's these imperfect, flawed men who had perfect ideas about the architecture and the implementation of a democratic republic, a constitutional republic, but it hasn't really been implemented that way. And I think because so many people have taken advantage of this system, but the broken windows theory in sociology, when one window is broken in a neighborhood, yeah, you're laughing. So I was a finance and sociology major, but I have a lot of
Nice.
sociologists in the family. But it's something that it got disproven academically, but I view it to be one of the most true things in life. That when there's one broken window, well, you look around and you start to think, well, the rest of it doesn't matter. I don't care. I'm going to go graffiti. I'm going to litter. And society slowly breaks down. And I think that's happened from our leaders over, for a very long time. But it's one of these things that, people should strive to be imperfectly perfect individuals, but they should strive to participate civically. And I think that that's something we can all play a role in, and at local levels, at state levels, at federal levels. But it should be one of these things that, in addition to coaching youth sports, to mentoring, be involved politically. And I think that's how you slowly change a society for the better.
Agreed. Again, you said so much that I want to react to. I want to go back to your thread, about service, and you mentioned civic participation. I'm like a marketing person by nature. I think a lot of these things need a rebrand. Like people need to understand how cool some of these roles are and how much impact you can have. You mentioned a lot of these young men who grew up on the internet who are like very technical and interested in technology. It's like those people should become air traffic controllers, which is like a dying
Hmm.
industry and so important. It would be great for some nerdy person in a good way who's interested in like,
Hmm.
the whatever, the environment, the built world. Um, that's something that we need fresh perspectives on. And I imagine you probably also have a lot of ideas on kind of like making these more appealing again. I know that you tease online that you'd be interested in potentially maybe running for office. You even share some fun graphics, of which I know a little bit more about, but tell us more about how you think about that decision. To me, a lot of what you said, and this is something that I say to myself, is like, I'm trying to live my life in a way that I'm minimizing regrets. Like looking back, I don't want to have any regrets and just saying yes to a lot of things. What's the appeal of going into office to you? And what are some of the things you haven't mentioned that you would want to do?
Yeah, so it is definitely something that I tease. And I view social media as it's kind of my social experiment that I'm able to put ideas out there, get feedback, tailor the ideas, but take a pulse. And I look at it as it's a unique skill set that I think most influencers, they look at society and and the internet and I'm doing stuff for likes, or I'm doing it to get a brand deal. I've been using Twitter to understand the minds of young men for 4 years, and it's been the best learning experience. But I look at it, that's a unique ability that I can use if I decide to run for office and I'm fortunate enough to get elected. That then I can use that to take the pulse of the constituents and simply be a voice of the people. And like a lot of people on the internet will say I'm a man of the people, and that's what I pride myself on, because I think it's being able to listen to people, right? And to understand them. But so I look at it as I'm someone I can take people saying whatever they want to about me. My favorite thing someone ever said, an insult wise on the internet, was melted Kendall dipshit, and I still laugh about it. And my mother calls me it sometimes, but like that stuff, it rolls off my shoulders. And but I'm a pretty confident person, but most people, the stuff on the internet will kind of get to someone, and I've learned how to play this game. So I look at it as, okay, at a larger scale, people will have their opinions and say things. I don't really care, but if I do run for office, I want to make it a very public learning experience, that I want people to see exactly how you get involved and you have a campaign and you create this organization of individuals to give them a voice, really. And so I look at it as, for anything that I do, I want it to be a public learning experience, because to your point, I view it as the more you can give transparency and an openness on this process that historically has been very closed, then the more it could encourage someone to run for office, which is what we need. We need more younger people thinking about the idea of, perhaps I could go be involved civically. I mean, being a politician is a great career for people who are bad at every other career they've had. Look at Abraham Lincoln, right? And it's like, I mean, Ulysses S. Grant is one of the most remarkable presidents we've had. This guy, he's 37 years old. He went to West Point, and so he's like 21st in his class in West Point. And basically, there are rumors of him being an alcoholic his whole time in the army. And then Robert E. Lee, the perfect Virginia gentleman, he graduates second in the class at West Point. So these two guys. So Grant's 37. He married a woman from Kentucky, and so she had slaves. He didn't believe in slavery, and she was from a very wealthy family. His father owned a leather tannery across the river in Ohio. So it became this rift in his wife's side, that he didn't want the slave, and they were living in Ohio. But his career after the army, it was pretty shit. And so he's 37 working at his father's leather tanning facility, and he hated the smell of it because he couldn't do anything else. Then the Civil War breaks out, and he's like, okay, I mean, I went to West Point, I've led men before, maybe this is a good opportunity. And he gets in a clerical position for the first 3 weeks of the war. He's on the third floor of this building thinking about jumping out the window, offing himself. And then he was able to go through kind of some break in history, get in charge of a small group, and then a larger, and then progressively larger. And then he was the one who came to the decisive victory. And then Lee, his former classmate, who's Mr. Perfect, had to surrender to. But everyone said he was an alcoholic and a loser before that. And he goes on to be president, and one of the most formative Americans in our history, just as Lincoln was. But it's one of these things that you don't have to be perfect to be a politician, but I think you have to strive to be perfect, and you have to strive to have ideas. And so, to your question on what I would run on, well, one of the ideas that I have is defense tech is something that's severely underinvested in, but is now becoming kind of like in the zeitgeist. There's only ever been two unicorns, so billion-dollar plus companies in the defense tech industry. And since this dinner called the Last Supper in 1993, there's been so much consolidation for they're now called the primes, but like your Northrop Grumman's of the world, right? So there's a lack of innovation. But where I grew up in McLean, Virginia, so that's in the eighth congressional district in Virginia. So the Pentagon's there, 79,000 federal employees, one of which is my father. And so I look at it, but there's this high school, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. It's the magnet school. I did not go there. I didn't even take the test because I clearly wasn't going to go there. Because I don't think I got a B above a B until I was in high school. Actually, it was AP history. It was like the U.S. history was the first one. Time I got an A, which is interesting in hindsight. But so that high school, if you look at the Wikipedia list, alumni list alone, hundreds of billions of dollar of value have been created by those alumni. But in Fairfax County, the school district goes from 300 million in the green to 200 million in the red. So $500 million swing in 1 year. And then you have these just cowardly local politicians saying, oh, we need a casino because it's the only way we're going to get tax revenue to support the school system. And it's like, it's so infuriating. It is intellectually dishonest and it's lazy. And I look at legalizing gambling is something that's so predatory. It destroys the moral fabric of a society. And when they say it brings in tax revenue, it actually doesn't. It takes away from the local businesses that are in the area because that's disposable income being spent at the casino. And so that would be one of the main things that would, instill me to run that anger over just these losers who are like, yeah, let's shove that down people's, throats and create a moral decline in society because we're so bad at our job and we overspend and we have no fiscal discipline that this is all we got. And it's just like we should not live in that society. We should live in a society that is an idyllic society, right? And so I look at it as okay, everyone's focused on this small pie. So the property taxes are going to keep increasing. There's going to continue to be budget deficits, but like, let's think a different way. Let's think bigger. How do we do this? So we have all this intellectual capital in the Northern Virginia area as evidenced by Thomas Jefferson High School alone. But what do those kids do? So they're going to go to Stanford and then they're going to drop out after a year because they get a Teal Fellowship. Well, I don't want to live in that world where then this brilliant mind from Fairfax County goes and lives in Silicon Valley and they have a company based out of Delaware. And I was driving around Tyson's Corner last summer and I see how many vacant office buildings there are. And I'm like, why the fuck are there so many office buildings here in the first place? So I start to research the area more. And the internet, the precursor to the internet, ARPANET, it was created by government employees in 1968 in Arlington. Then it goes and ultimately MA East, which was the first large scale internet hookup, is in Tysons. AOL gets headquartered in Tysons in the 80s. They expand westward to Ashburn in the 90s, but with that created Data Center Alley. So 70% of the entire world's daily internet traffic flows through the tubes in Northern Virginia. Most fascinating statistic there is to me. And it's like, hey, like dipshits, why are we not the capital of innovation? We used to be, we had great companies and they all left. But there's all these smart minds that have also left. They've gone to Wall Street, they've gone to Silicon Valley. Because if you're a bright mind, you really only have two options. It's one of those two places. And I want to live in a world, a society where people can go make a shit ton of money and do something for the betterment of the country. So I started thinking of defense tech. One of the ideas would be taking about 3K per household from the property tax. And you have this pot, call it that equates to 600 million. So you're not raising taxes, you're reallocating them from the local boards of supervisors who can't manage the money to save their lives and then have to say we have a casino. Okay. So then I would want to run on a bill that I'd already have written because I think it's important that if you're going to get elected, you should legislate. Like you should go there to do big things for the community you represent. And so this bill that would then be a bipartisan DoD matching, basically then doubling that 600 million to 1.2 billion, which comes out of the 886 billion of the DoD budget, right? So it's a fraction, it's nothing, but that would be invested in the local ecosystem to make it so software innovation is headquartered in Northern Virginia and it'd be bipartisan bill. So you'd have hardware innovation for defense tech somewhere in the Midwest. And I look at it as like, okay, the infrastructure's here, the mines, they've left, they need to return. But if you're injecting that much into these startups, you're going to attract more businesses, right? My ultimate goal, and I'll say this, I want to be governor of Virginia in 2029 because I look at it as so the Constitution allows us to create new courts. And when you look at the world as China and their closed ecosystem versus the rest of the world and our open ecosystem in the internet, well, the US has to lead in intellectual thought and adjudication as it relates to the internet. We're going to have to judge the algorithm. We're going to have all of these tough conversations. And when you look at why a majority, almost 60% of companies are headquartered in Delaware, it's because the DuPont family, super wealthy, that they create the Court of Chancery, which has no jury, right? That's the most un-American thing that there is. Like, there has to be a jury of citizens who adjudicate these questions of society. It's one of the reasons I get in this argument with my girlfriend, who's an attorney, about just the evil of arbitration because there's no jury. But I digress. But so I want to create this court of the internet in Virginia that is of this highly educated population. Ideally, there's a way, when you're getting your driver's license or something, to kind of opt into a higher security type clearance to be part of a jury that is determining these large scale important questions, rather than it just getting handed out to some court in Delaware where these companies aren't even based, which is a ridiculous concept that we just say that's how it is, right? Like, I think that's the problem with a lot of things in life. We have to ask, well, why is it? How did we get there? And then, okay, well, like, why don't we kind of undo it and do things in the right way? Because if you have a court that is essentially like the Switzerland of the internet, that it's going to be fair and balanced, and there's going to be a jury of citizens, well, more companies are going to want to be headquartered there. They're going to want to be based there, actually, rather than Delaware, because it's a business friendly jurisdiction. And well, why is that? Because it's court of chancery. And it's like, okay, I mean, these judges, William and Mary, UVA, where I went to law school, like, these are some of the best places in the country. You can start to seed this at an early stage and grow it as these minds grow. But like, we're going to be faced with so many big, important, really challenging questions. And as Americans, we have to answer it for the world, because the rest of the world isn't going to do that. The UN's a joke, NATO's a joke. And it's like, you can sit there and act like these problems will figure themselves out, or we're going to live in a world that instead of, having a king, we're going to have these tech oligarchs that are essentially more powerful than politicians. And they're going to continue to control essentially what is supposed to be a democratic republic.
Again, so much for me to react to. I don't even know where to start. For all the young men who follow you, who may be listening, and really anyone, actually, women, men, you name it, who are listening, who want to feel hope and optimism right now, what would you say to them? Where are you finding hope and optimism, and what should people feel excited about in this country?
Well, one of the interesting concepts, so America, like the bankruptcy code in America, was basically created to give people a second chance, right? But I think that idea of like you can always reinvent yourself. And I started probably a bad way to start, but it's the way that you can always reinvent yourself. Like, I'm someone who I'm a lifelong learner. Like, I'm constantly learning new things and reading stuff, right? And I've been able to, have a bunch of essentially different focuses in my short career so far. But it's because I never looked at myself as being kind of one dimensional in terms of my intellectual interests. And so, being able to go to law school and then be a banker, now do stuff with defense tech, do investor relations, be interested in politics. It's one of these things that I look at as like, well, if you're constantly striving to learn And the world is changing so quickly. We don't live in the world of our parents that it's like you do your 20 years in a job and you get a pension, right? It's funny because growing up, my parents always said, okay, get a job with the government. And well, they're firing a lot of people in the government. And if I decide to run for office, like I always joke that, it's a long application process, but I tell my mom I'm going to try one day to get a job with the government. But the other was work at Booz Allen Hamilton, the consulting firm. 98% of their 11 billion in revenue is from contracts with the federal government. They laid off 7,600 people on Friday, so that's not really an option either. But you look at how the world is changing so quickly, and for those who are able to take advantage of the changing landscape, whether it's with AI or any of these new technologies, there's an opportunity, right? And I think that we've grown up and we've been told to focus and have hyper niche areas of expertise, but we don't live in that world anymore. And I think it's important to constantly be learning because you can always reinvent yourself. The way I look at this is history repeats itself in different cycles, right? And so the internet that was invented in Northern Virginia and essentially created this, you know, free fall of opportunity. Well, you can take that, you can do it again with defense tech. You can just do it again over and over if you study the cycles, that it's cycles and it's prisms of understanding. Where you look at the industrial revolution, you look at the invention of the printing press, these are all formative changes in society, and there's going to continue to be them, but there's going to be them at more and more quickness, shortness of duration from we're going to leap to the next iteration of these large scale things. So there's always going to be an opportunity. But I think the biggest thing is that you always have to look at yourself as this kind of imperfect work of art that each experiences, another thread in the rich tapestry that is your life, and that maybe one didn't work out. Like there's a lot of people that probably say I was a horrible investment banker, and I probably was. I genuinely did not enjoy it. I found it like super boring and no intellectual stimulation, and the attention to detail. I just didn't care about the color of a line on PowerPoint half the time, right? Or the alignment of a logo. But it doesn't mean that I can't take lessons from that and then apply it to something else as I do now. But I think it's one of these things is you have to look at life as kind of it's almost like a round of a boxing match that you're going to get knocked down in most of these rounds, and then you get up and you constantly have this optimism and hope that I think has been lost. But I think that with the advent of new technologies, there is so much more opportunity than there's previously been. And it's those who embrace the opportunity and the challenges, they're the ones who get rewarded. But I would say it's never stop betting on yourself, because you may, with venture investments, one out of maybe 10 is going to hit, right? But it's the same thing with yourself in life. Like, look at Ulysses S. Grant, right? That everyone said he was just failed alcoholic, and then he ends up being the most decisive general in the most decisive war arguably one of the two of our country's history. That without him, where would the world be, right? And it's just a fascinating concept that I think you read history and then you can get constantly inspired by these people. Like, by all accounts, Jefferson was failed as governor of Virginia, and then he goes on to be president, right? But it's just this fascinating thing of, you have to look at history and these people who were failures until they weren't, and then that will give you hope and inspiration.
You know what I keep telling myself is like their doubt is my alpha. And
Yes, exactly.
to
Hmm.
your point, you can reinvent yourself any day, tomorrow, the next day, and we're always one decision away from a completely different life. So I appreciate
Exactly.
your commitment to learning and transformation, and trying new things. So this was such a fun conversation. I appreciate you doing this with me.
Yes.
Where can people find you and learn more about you?
I am on social media. All my handles are at it's Mark Moran. And Mark Moran was taken when I came back from F Boy Island. And so that's what it is across socials. I'm most active on Twitter, but that's the best place to reach me. And I try to be as responsive as I can.